Chapter 133, An Unexpected Journey. May 4, 1996, Full Moon Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Great Britain Horcruxes left. 4. Larket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Remus Lupin's headache was bad this time. He knew what it was from, of course. He was a werewolf, and he going to sprout fur just as soon as the sun set. One of the side effects of being a werewolf was a worsening series of headaches which started a week before the full moon and were nearly unbearable the day of the transformation. He remembered his first few times he had transformed. The transformation had been very painful, and he had injured several people. Thank God he hadn't bitten any. He would have been devastated if he had actually sentenced innocent people to lycanthropy. It had taken a while for the Whomping Willow to grow tall enough and strong enough to prevent people from following him into the Shrieking Shack. Until then, he had to be very careful. Times had changed, however. Thanks to Severus Snape, he no longer had to fear turning into a werewolf. The Wolfsbane potion would allow him to keep his mind while he was in wolf form, preventing him from going rabid nuts and attacking everybody in sight. The only disadvantage of the Wolfsbane potion was the fact that he had to stop by Hogwarts every single day in the week, leading up to the full moon to pick up today's dose. Snape had tried to make it so Lupin only had to stop by once per month, but the components required tended to lose their potency very quickly. Hence, one visit per day for a week. The fact that the components degraded quickly required Lupin to drink the potion as close as possible to sundown. He could drink it earlier in the day just to get it out of the way. Usually, that worked. However, there was one time when it didn't. Dumbledore had told him that he had been about to attack someone and was stopped at the last moment by a Petrificus totalis. That had terminated the morning appointments rather abruptly. He wasn't going to make the same mistake this time. Sundown was in about an hour or so, and he'd given himself some extra time to speak with the inevitable Hogwarts students who tried to intercept him before he reached Snape's office. McGonagall, who had taken over Dumbledore's old position as headmistress, always made sure that every single window between the main entrance and Snape's office was closed tightly before allowing Lupin to come. Once he was in the building, he could talk as much as he wanted with students as long as he stayed on the prescribed route. There weren't any students to greet him today. That was understandable, however. Most of the students he had been particularly close to were fifth years now, and they would have been preparing for owls. Curiously, he did encounter Draco Malfoy, a fifth year, wandering through the corridor near Snape's office. They didn't speak much, though Draco seemed more interested in him than usual. Lupin wished him luck on his owls and continued down the hall. Draco was a clever and very driven young man. He'd probably do well if he managed to keep his proto-Death Eater beliefs from taking over his life. Now that Voldemort had returned, having a career as a Death Eater in your resume would be detrimental to finding a job after graduation. He was grateful that Snape had managed to put his grudge against the marauders behind him. When he had first heard about the Wolfsbane potion, he had wondered if Snape would just let him transform without it just to spite him. Thankfully, that had not been the case. However, there were times where Snape left the potion for him in his office and was pointedly absent when he arrived. Snape did what he had to do, but he didn't enjoy it. Lupin arrived at Snape's office and found that it was one of those days. Snape wasn't there, but the potion had been prepared and was sitting on the desk. There were times where Snape had tried to spite him by hiding the special chalice containing the potion somewhere else in the room and forcing him to look for it, but not today. Lupin noticed that a little of the potion appeared to have spilled over the edge, as if Snape had jostled the chalice when he'd put it down. Thankfully, there was still more than enough to prevent a violent transformation. It eventually dawned on him that Snape was probably a bit swamped at the moment preparing students for owls, and was probably a bit distracted. Shrugging off the ramifications of the spill, he grasped the cup and started lifting it to his mouth. However, it never made it there. He felt a jerk below his navel and found himself flying through space, cup in hand. Lupin stiffened in alarm. Turning the wolfsbane chalice into a portkey to play a joke on Lupin was a very bad idea. It sounded like something Snape would have wanted to do, except that Snape would have known not to do it because of the risk of an unprotected transformation. Travel by Portkey was chaotic, and potions were almost guaranteed to spill out midway through the trip. He covered the top of the cup with his free hand and hoped he would have a soft landing. About 30 seconds later, the Portkey dropped him in the midst of a large crowd of people. He fell onto a 40-something wearing a Manchester United jersey. The man screamed and punched at him, accusing him of being drunk. The chalice fell out of his hand and fell on its side, spilling its contents across what appeared to be a concrete floor. His wand fell out of his pocket and went rolling away. He had time for a brief glance around the area. This was a sports stadium of some sort. It looked like a place for a Muggle football match. There were maybe 50,000 Muggles in the stadium. The scoreboard read Arsenal 0, Manchester United 0. Lupin suddenly realized what the practical Joker had done and went pale as a ghost. Either Snape had gone back to Voldemort again, or a Death Eater had broken into Hogwarts and messed with the chalice. The Portkey had effectively transported him into the middle of a large group of Muggles just as the moon was rising, and had done so without giving him the opportunity to drink the precious wolfsbane potion. This wasn't a practical joke, he realized. It was a Death Eater operation, which would likely turn into something the Muggles would interpret as a biological terrorist attack. They had turned him into a living weapon. He needed to get the hell out of there, and fast. Unfortunately, he had to retrieve the chalice and the wand first. He didn't know what the wolfsbane spell components would do to Muggles, and the Muggles would receive an electric shock if they tried to touch the wand. There were a few clouds in the sky, but not many. Thankfully, the moon was behind one of the clouds. He had some time. Rummaging around desperately and knocking over someone's beer in the process, he asked some of the Muggles around him to look for the chalice. The Muggles just stared at him as if he were crazy and started asking him where he'd come from. He ignored them and went searching for the wand. He looked under seats left and right and found nothing. The search was hampered greatly by the fact that it was night and the wand had rolled into the shadows. Meanwhile, someone said that she'd found the chalice and tapped him on the back with it. He had just located the wand and was reaching for it when the cloud moved away and the moon came out. He had time to think 2 words before the transformation began and he lost his mind. Oh shit. Chapter 134. Index Patient. May 4, 1996. Full moon, Wembley Stadium, London, England. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. Asterisk warning. Major character death. It had taken her several years and hundreds of lottery tickets, but Lauren Mistry had finally managed to score tickets to a soccer match at Wembley Stadium. Just looking at the price on the ticket stub made her realize that the whole endeavor had been worthwhile. She'd have never ponied up £100 at one sitting for this. She'd managed to score a halfway decent seat near midfield. She had been concerned that she'd wind up near one of the goals where she would have no sense of depth and virtually no view of the opposite end of the field. She'd been to a few soccer games before. However, they had been primarily local events and not major league games. She'd have to make the most of this, as she'd likely never make it into this stadium again. She'd only had 1 beer so far. She usually didn't drink, but inevitably she got involved with the noise and the culture at the games and downed a couple of pints. Not here, however. For one thing, the drinks were ludicrously expensive. For another, she wanted to savor as much of the match as possible without her mind partially fuzzed. About midway through the first period, with the score still 0-0, she decided that it was time for another drink. She decided to go non-alcoholic, though, and decided to try out something new: Blast Cola. There were several Blast products available at the concession stand, but only the cola seemed to be non-alcoholic. Ponying up another £3, she grabbed a can of Blast and planted it next to her. That was when an ornately jeweled cup suddenly appeared out of nowhere, crashed into the can, and knocked it over. Blast cola mingled with a bizarre-looking grey broth. Lauren swore and looked in the direction the cup had come from. She saw a tall man with thin hair and a pencil mustache climbing up off the floor. He was wearing very strange robes, and Lauren was fairly certain that she hadn't seen him in this section before. The man looked confused and very panicked. Ignoring what appeared to be a small cut on his head, he stared at the sky for a moment and then shouted, "People, I need your help. I need for you to find an ornate goblet that I've lost. Hurry, there's no time to lose." Confused, but relieved that she had something to do, she picked up the fallen goblet and turned back to the man, who had bent down to look under the seats in the row in front of him. She told him that she'd found the goblet and tapped him on the back with it. He ignored her, however, and continued his search. It looked like he had lost something else as well. Shrugging, she left the goblet next to him and turned back to face the game. A few seconds later, the moon came out from behind a cloud. Hopefully, that would help the man find whatever he was looking for under the seats. It didn't seem to be helping. He heard the man groan in agony. Whatever he had lost must have been valuable. She turned back to him to ask if he needed help. What she saw made her freeze in her tracks. The man's body almost looked like it was changing shape. Or was it? The moon often casts strange shadows going in and out of clouds. If it was an illusion, though, it was a very convincing one, as several other people were watching him as well. A couple of them had backed off slightly. One of them had moved forward to see if he could help. Finally, the moon cleared the last wisps of cloud. It blazed, in all its glory, on a tremendous wolf-like dog about the size of a man. This was just wrong, she thought. She could have sworn that she had seen a sign which prohibited guests from bringing pets into the stadium. She shook her head to clear it as more people began to back away. The man who had tried to help the newcomer hesitated for a moment. Then, with some trepidation, excuse me, but I don't think pets." Then the dog howled. Heads spun all across several sections to stare at the source of the sound. The dog had perched on one of the empty seats and was screaming at the moon. It looked like a werewolf out of one of those children's cartoons. Jaws dropped across 10 rows as fans, thinking that someone had blown one of those humongous South African horns, saw the tremendous creature sitting on the chair. The dog turned away from the moon and then disturbingly looked right at Lauren. A second later, it was on her. She did what she could to fend it off, but a 51 woman wouldn't fare that well against a 200-pound monster, which was likely rabid to boot. The creature bit her on the arm, sending warmth and a bizarre tingling sensation throughout her body. Swearing, she punched the animal in the muzzle with her other hand and bent down to make a tourniquet out of one of her shoelaces. Her motion may have saved her life. The dog lunged at her again, its jaws snapping where her head had been. Wincing in pain, she was now convinced it was rabid. She watched as it jumped over her head and began mauling the man in the seat next to her. By this time, half the stadium was staring at the events in her section. Down below, on the field, someone was assessed a yellow card, and no one noticed. People were screaming and trying to get away from the animal, but they were all hemmed in by the narrow aisles and half-folded seats. The wolf dog, whatever, of course, took full advantage of the confusion, going after everything within reach of its jaws. She saw 20 people fold up like pocket rulers, wincing and trying to clean up bite marks which looked similar to hers. One of them, oddly, looked at the moon and shivered. Lauren took a quick glance at the moon. It seemed a little brighter than it had before, but that was likely because she was still in shock from the attack. By this point, the authorities had noticed the altercation. Security guards were heading in their direction, talking into their intercoms. Backing away from the animal as quickly as she could, she watched it jump 4 rows further up into the stands and attack the people there. 5 or 6 people went down with bites. Despite her injury, she still wanted to help. There was only one thing she could think of doing. She raced over to where she had left the ornate goblet, picked it up, and threw it at the animal. The cup hit it on the head, causing it to pull its teeth out of a child's arm and turn its blazing eyes to her. It howled once more and prepared itself for a leap. Then there were 3 sharp cracks. The animal shrieked, and Lauren saw 3 red splotches began to grow on its chest. It wouldn't go down, however. It jumped into the air, heading straight at Lauren as more gunshots rang out. She put her hands over her head and ducked. As she did, she noticed a rod about a foot long hiding underneath her seat. She tried to pick it up and received an awful jolt. Damn power cable. The animal landed on her back with a thud and didn't move. Risking a look up at the animal, she saw that there were now no fewer than 7 bullets in its body. One look into its eyes revealed that it was most definitely dead. The security officers began ordering everyone away from the body. They then immediately started asking everyone in the vicinity whether this had been their dog. Most of them said that a man with a thin mustache had appeared in the vicinity, apparently out of nowhere, about the time the animal had appeared. Some people claimed, hesitantly, that the man had turned into the dog, but they couldn't bring themselves to believe it. When asked where the man was, they looked around the area and reported no sign of him. The cops said the man would likely be brought up on charges and started asking for more detailed descriptions. One of the cops came over to her and asked her for her version of the story. She provided it, thought it didn't really add much to what they already knew. However, she felt obligated to bring something up. She pointed at the seat where she had felt the power cable. "Officer, I believe there's a dangerous electrocution hazard in the stadium here. There's a live electrical wire right down here in the concrete." The officer stared at her. "Really? Where?" She pointed at the cable. "Right there, officer." The officer frowned and bent over to look at the object. His eyes widened and he turned to her. "That's not a power cable, ma'am. That looks like a magic wand." Lauren stared at him. "A wand?" "Yes, ma'am. I think we've been attacked by an evil wizard, perhaps this Voldemort we've been hearing about. I suspect Voldemort is the man with the mustache, perhaps with a disguise. He teleported this wolf or dog over here and must have left his wand behind. You've been a great service, ma'am. Now, if you'll head over there with the rest of the victims, we'll give you all rabies shots. The Arsenal coach has generously let us use their locker room as a temporary triage room so we can treat the injured. Now hold still. We'll need to get that wand." Lauren watched as the officer grabbed a souvenir program. Making sure that he did not touch the wand, he used it to lift the wand and put it in a box. He then locked the box and passed it to another cop. He then told her to follow her over to the triage area. For some reason, Lauren looked back at the moon. It definitely seemed brighter, very strange. She shrugged and turned back to the officer. "It's a good thing you killed that creature, officer. How many people were attacked?" The officer swore. 28, ma'am, including 1 fatality. It could have been a bloody lot worse. Those 27 people should be thankful they survived with only a couple of bites. Chapter 135. Rodolphus and Hamas. May 5, 1996, Hamas headquarters location classified West Bank next Pav. 136 Eric Street. Horcruxes left. 4 Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Rodolphus Lestrain did the best he could to not trip over things as the militants pushed and shoved him around the complex. He had asked for an audience with the head of Hamas's militant wing. At first, the Hamas representative he had spoken with had been reluctant to ask for one. However, the man's eyes had opened as wide as saucers when Rodolphus had shown him the document from the Saudi king. It appeared that Fard's seal was worth a lot in these parts. Royal approval or not, no one was allowed to see inside the headquarters of Hamas, or even where the facility was, unless they were members of the organization. The representative had covered Rodolphus's eyes with a blindfold and led him into a car. Rodolphus thought about magically turning the blindfolds into one-way mirrors so that he could see out, but they couldn't see his eyes. He decided against it, however. The driver did not know he was a wizard, and Rodolphus didn't know how he would react. The driver had done a good job, confusing his sense of direction on the way in. The Death Eater had no idea where he had gone, and even a point me spell wouldn't work with the blindfold on, as he wouldn't have been able to see the wand. Eventually, after 5 minutes of prodding and a bodily search, one man yelped when he tried to take the wand. He was ushered into a seat and locked in place. He heard footsteps recede into the distance, followed by the slamming and locking of a door. He also heard the distinct sound of a Muggle projectile weapon being cocked. 10 seconds later, a voice echoed through the room. It told him to remove his blindfold and stay seated. He was in a completely empty, featureless square room about maybe 10 feet on a side. The only thing inside it, other than him, was a small object which Rodolphus recognized as a Muggle speaking device. The box crackled and spoke. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lestrange. I am sorry for the rough treatment, but we have to take precautions here." Rodolphus nodded. "I understand. Pardon me for asking, but how may I address you?" The voice hesitated for a moment. "You may call me the Sheik." "Are you the head of Hamas?" Another hesitation, followed by, "My exact identity is irrelevant, Mr. Lestrange. However, you may rest assured that I speak with the authority of the Hamas Executive Council." "That will be enough, Sheik. At any rate, I've come from Saudi Arabia on a mission which, I believe, will be in our mutual interest." The voice sounded suspicious. "So I've heard, Mr. Lestrange. However, to the best of my knowledge, you are a British national. Why would a British national be working for Saudi Arabia?" Rodolphus smiled. "Saudi Arabia is an ally of my group. I made a presentation to King Fahd, and he joined up immediately. Now, I hope to recruit your organization as well. We've already spoken with Hezbollah, and they've been supportive. His Majesty, as you can tell, is anxious that we get the word out." "I see, Mr. Lestrange. And what is the name of your group?" Rodolphus had this alibi already planned out. "Wizards for Palestine, Sheik." A gasp burst out of the box, and Rodolphus thought he heard rustling from somewhere outside the room. The voice asked, "You are a wizard, Mr. Lestrange?" "Yes, Sheik. If you wish, I can provide a demonstration. Are you capable of observing what I am doing in this room? I suspect you've got a hidden camera in here for security purposes." "Yes, Mr. Lestrange." "Good. Will you permit me to retrieve my wand? I can use it to cast a spell." "No, you must stay unarmed while in this facility." Rodolphus shrugged. "In that case, I will be forced to attempt apparition, or teleportation as you often call it. However, in order to do so, I will likely have to escape from this chair. You have my wand, Sheik. Next time, use a blanket or something to pick it up so you don't get shocked." "I will not attempt to escape if you have my wand. Is this acceptable to you?" "Yes, Mr. Lestrange." "Good. Now observe." With that, Rodolphus focused on the far wall and apparated out of the chair. He materialized on the far side of the room. Bowing in all directions, presumably he'd reached the hidden camera that way, he returned to the chair and sat down. The voice whistled. "Indeed, Mr. Lestrange, you are a wizard. I take it there is a large group of you who is supportive of our cause." Rodolphus smiled. "Yes, Sheik. Many of us, particularly in Britain and India, believe that the occupying Zionists need to be taken down a peg. We wish to join your organization and use our magical skills on your behalf." "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Lestrange. How many wizards will you be able to recruit for us?" "At least 4, Sheik, including myself. I believe we'll be able to bring a few more in, however. All of us are highly skilled and are willing to kill to achieve our aims." The voice seemed delighted. "4 wizards like you could work wonders for us, Mr. Lestrange. The Zionists' Ministry of Magic will have their hands full with the likes of you." Rodolphus bowed. "My thoughts exactly, Sheik. In exchange, all we ask for is to be on your executive council so we can attend your meetings and help with your plans and agenda. We will do our share by making sure no Muggle can eavesdrop." "That proposal is acceptable. Allah has blessed us this day. If you pass our test, we will welcome you aboard. Rodolphus blinked. A test, Sheik. What test? A simple test, Mr. Lestrange. You have said that you are willing to kill for our cause. It is time for you to put your dedication to the test. If you would be so good as to turn your back to the door for a second. He did so, and the door opened behind him. He heard someone swearing in a Semitic language which wasn't Arabic, probably Hebrew. He heard a rattling sound, and the newcomer yelped in pain. The door slammed once more. Ignoring the newcomer's pleas for clemency, the voice spoke once again to Rodolphus. Look behind you. The creature you see handcuffed behind you is a Zionist demon we have taken prisoner. Its name is Gabriel Sigel, and it works for the Mossad. We caught it spying on our facilities here and captured it. We have returned your wand so you can take your test. You can see it on the floor maybe 10 feet from the demon. The prisoner shouted something at the barks. The voice ignored him. Mr. Lestrange, deal Allah's justice to this thing. Rodolphus didn't need to be told twice. Keeping an eye warily on the door, he hit the prisoner in the chest with an Avada Kedavra. The Mossad agent crumpled to the floor. Bowing once again in all 4 directions, he put the wand next to the box and sat back down in the chair. Several voices began babbling excitedly out of the box on the floor. Eventually, the first speaker barked something and shut them up. Returning to Lestrange, the voice said, Congratulations, Mr. Lestrange. You are one of us. Chapter 136. You built a time machine out of a DeLorean. May 7, 1996. DeLorean Motor Corporation, Headquarter Shumble, Texas, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 4. Larkett, Ring, Snake, Cup. Eric Street recognized the vehicle as soon as he walked in the door. He was actually a fan of Muggle movies and had seen all 3 Back to the Future movies. The car definitely stood out, especially with the gull wing doors open. The models being showcased were used and all dated from the 1980s. Apparently they weren't making any new cars. That surprised him for a moment, but he realized that it would work to his advantage. The more the car looked like the one from the movies, the more likely people would be to buy it. Shauna Santana, the chairwoman of the Big Thicket facility, had nearly fainted when he told her of his idea. Her first reaction had been to dismiss it outright because of one obvious problem which she thought the Muggles would not be prepared for. Eric countered this, however, with the requirement that the equipment required to trigger the problem would have to be provided by a wizard, and that any Muggle wanting to use said equipment would have to go through extensive training. Chairwoman Santana then brought up another possible issue. Eric, who had been expecting that, showed her an article in a British automotive journal which almost knocked her off her feet again. However, she thought it over and grudgingly said that it might work. That had been just when Eric had been hoping for. He'd run the idea by several Wizarding Services Corporation employees, and they'd all been for it. If Chairwoman Santana were willing to loan him some money, he would promise to pay it back within a year. He told him he didn't think he'd need it, but just in case, it was a good thing to do in case everything went south, which he didn't think it would. Santana had thought about it for a minute. Eventually, she said she'd allow it as long as she joined Eric for his presentation at the DeLorean headquarters. He agreed to that immediately. The 40-something woman was staring at the vehicles as well, an unreadable expression on her face. He suspected that she was having second thoughts about this whole endeavor. Perhaps the interview with the president would change things. He hoped it would. The fact that the cars being displayed were from the 1980s would reduce the costs to create Eric's idea a great deal. Old cars had fewer and less complicated electronics than newer ones, so they would need to purchase less Argon-38 to enchant them. The price of the gas had gone up by a factor of 3 already over the past 3 months. It seemed that other people were thinking along the same lines he was. He had to get his project out the door before someone else stole his idea. The door leading to the main office opened, and the president of the company stepped out. He was wearing a suit and tie and looked at the 2 wizards a bit quizzically. He must be unfamiliar with the dress robes, Eric thought. The president shrugged and extended his hand. Mr. Street, Miss Santana, I'm the president of DeLorean Motor Corporation. You wish to see me? Eric nodded. Yes, sir. We've got a bit of business proposition for you involving your DeLoreans. Can we discuss it in your office? The president turned on his heel and motioned for them to follow. By all means, Mr. Street, come on in. The two wizards entered the president's office and took seats on the other side of his desk. So tell me, Mr. Street, what can I do for you? Eric smiled. I was thinking of a joint venture which would make us a lot of money selling DeLoreans. The president winced. Mr. Street, I must warn you that we aren't really associated with the car manufacturer. The real DeLorean Corporation went out of business almost 15 years ago. We just take care of, sell, and refurbish the used vehicles. We don't make new cars, as you can tell from the showroom. Eric shook his head. Don't worry about that, sir. If my guess is right, we'll be able to make enough money off of this stunt to bring the company back to life and get you to start making new cars. The president grunted. I doubt it, but we'll see. So what's your plan? In response, Chairwoman Santana brought something out of her pocket. It looked like a small hourglass hanging from a chain. Being careful not to touch the hourglass, she asked him, Sir, have you ever seen one of these before? The president shook his head. Not really. I'm not big on jewelry and necklaces. Santana grinned. This isn't just a necklace, sir. It's a time turner. A time turner? What's that? A device which allows the wearer to travel through time. The president gasped in delight. Ha! Very interesting and ingenious. However, what would a device allowing someone to travel through time have to do with my DeLoreans? Then it hit him. His jaw dropped and his eyes widened. He sank back into his seat, his hand on his forehead. It took him a good 30 seconds for the shock to wear off enough for him to respond. This gave Eric to conclude his pitch. We can cast a spell which will allow the time turner to activate when, say, the vehicle gets to 88 mph. The president finally found his voice again. You're kidding. This has got to be a joke. Eric shook his head as both he and Santana put their wands on the president's desk. It isn't, so trust me, it's not. You'll see momentarily after we put our wands on our desk for our safety. The president's reply cut off abruptly as a second copy of Chairwoman Santana materialized next to him. The woman smiled and dangled the necklace in the air. Grinning, the first copy of the woman slowly walked towards her doppelganger. She threw the necklace around her neck and nudged the hourglass hanging from the chain a little. The woman disappeared just before she reached her clone. The president stared at her. What the hell? Santana explained. I walked over there and used the device to travel backwards in time to the point where I was still standing at the desk. This created a second copy of me. After the second copy appeared, you saw the original one move to the location where she jumped back through time and disappeared, completing the time loop. The president put his hand on his head again. Just like in Back to the Future, there were two of you running around. Santana nodded. Yes, sir. We removed our wands to prevent us from interfering with our clones and creating a time paradox. What would happen if that took place? Eric answered this. We would have died. Time travel is extremely dangerous. The fictional Dark Brown was indeed correct in that regard. The president shook his head. The insurance requirements for time travel would be enormous. Eric grinned. Not if we make the time turner a non-standard option which requires a long period of training before using it, plus a release of liability for time paradoxes in case it is abused. You have to get the time turner from a wizard in order to use it, and that's where we can enforce this. The president frowned. What good would this vehicle be if you can't travel through time? Eric shrugged. Time travel wasn't the only thing the car from the movie could do. Remember Mr. Fusion and the flying circuits. The president got the idea quickly. Let me guess. You can power it by magic and make it fly. Eric stood up, reached into his briefcase, and withdrew the British Journal article he had told Santana about. You may want to read this article, sir. The president looked down and glanced at the title. Bentley Pegasus. What the hell is the Bentley Pegasus? I've heard of the Bentley before, but... Eric sat back down. You'll see. The president looked over the article and whistled. They've got flying cars. Yes, sir. The enchantment is actually not that difficult, and I believe it will be possible to add safety features to prevent the vehicle from falling out of the sky and or rescuing passengers in case of trouble. Bentley used ejection seats, for instance. The president closed his eyes. Eric thought he was having visions of DeLoreans all over the skies. When he opened them again, he said, "If this works." Eric finished the sentence for him. We can use the proceeds to start making new cars with all these refinements and modern technology. You'll be selling new DeLoreans for the first time in 15 years. The president stared at the document in front of him. He didn't say anything, but the expression on the man's face betrayed him. Eric smiled. The president was going to go for it. Now the fun would begin. Chapter 137. Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. May 7, 1996. Hagrid's Warehouse, Washington. Deke, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. Hagrid was missing, and Grop didn't like it at all. Hagrid had told him several times that he would be back around 5:30 or so every day from his job at the zoo. He'd been doing that virtually every day so far. Granted, there had been one day when he'd gotten back at 6. Grop had been a little worried for a while, but thankfully his brother had returned before Grop had gotten frantic about it. It was now 7:45 though, and Hagrid still wasn't back. This was more than unusual. It was terrifying. Hagrid spent a lot of time working with animals, including dangerous ones like unicorns. Grop knew that his brother was an expert at caring for magical creatures. However, Hagrid had had a few close calls in the past. He'd burned off half of his beard at one point during the run-up to the Triwizard Tournament when a blast-ended Scroot hit him in the face. Thankfully, Madame Pomfrey had treated him quickly enough for him to not even be left with a scar. Unfortunately, Madame Pomfrey wasn't here. Grop was fairly certain that no one would be able to deal with complications if one of the animals attacked Hagrid. The implications were obvious. Grop would have to go rescue him and save him from whatever danger he was in. It was only appropriate. After all, Hagrid was his brother and the only friend he could trust. He was certain Hagrid would have done the same for him. Grop was a nice person, and nice people helped their families. He thought for a second about Hagrid's prohibition that he not leave the warehouse under any circumstances. What Hagrid said did make sense. People didn't know him and might be scared by his large size. However, Hagrid hadn't counted on his being injured by one of these animals. Grop had to help. He smiled when he considered the fact that he would be able to explain to the Muggles that giants could be friendly as well. He could be what the Muggles called a diplomat. Washington, D.C. had lots of diplomats in it. He'd fit right in. First things first, he had to get out of the warehouse. Hagrid had rolled down and locked the door after he'd left in the morning, as usual. The door was fairly small, about 13 feet high. He thought he'd be able to make it out if he ducked. He knew how doors worked, so he put his hand on the handle at the bottom so he could open the door. Unfortunately, he couldn't get his huge paws around the little handle. Grop panicked for a moment. He couldn't get out that way. However, he smiled when he realized there was another. Hagrid would be so proud of him because he was so smart. He raised a huge arm and started smashing at the handle. Metal flew in all directions, and soon he had created a hole large enough for him to stick his hand underneath it and force the door back up. The roll-up door slammed into the roof of the warehouse at a high rate of speed, cracking the roof and leaving the door tilted at a weird angle. He ducked and made it through the opening. When he stood once again, he was outside. He was on a small road which Hagrid had called a sidewalk. It was next to a larger road made out of what Hagrid called asphalt. There was a small sign which said Delaware Avenue nearby. It occurred to him that he had no idea where Hagrid was. However, there were lots of people in Washington, D.C. Maybe they could tell him how to get to the zoo. He saw a person in the distance and started running down the sidewalk. He was amused to notice that he left footprints in the sidewalk. That was good. He would be able to find his way back by retracing his steps. Occasionally, there would be explosions of water and gas when he put his foot down. He once nearly parboiled by a large cloud of steam and squawked in surprise when he felt a shock go through his leg and saw all the pretty red, yellow, and green lights turn off. He hoped Hagrid could fix those. He was very good at fixing things. He didn't mean to break anything. He'd have to apologize later. Nice people did that when they broke things. He heard horns behind him. He turned around and saw vehicles honking horns and heading in his direction. Two of them collided in the middle of the road as one of them stopped and a human got out. The human said something to him about a Stay-Puffed Marshmallow Man. He didn't know what that was, but the fact that human wanted to talk to him was good. He could find out where the zoo was that way. He didn't need to go after the first person he'd seen. He raced off the sidewalk and into the street. Vehicles swerved all over the place and began hitting each other. Grop, being a nice giant, wanted to fix everything. So he bent down, creating more footprints in the process, this time in the asphalt, and started using both his hands to lift the vehicles which had collided so they wouldn't block each other anymore. They didn't move, however. Grop, however, knew what to do with that. He tried pushing the vehicles to get them moving again. They wouldn't move. All that managed to do is elicit a group of screams in the distance. He turned to the man who had spoken to him. Being very gentle, he bent down and lifted the man. The man started screaming like a maniac and tried to break free. Meanwhile, many of the other humans put their hands to their mouths for some reason. He asked the man if he'd seen Hagrid. The man, strangely frightened, stammered that he hadn't seen Hagrid and recommended going to the zoo. Grop then asked for directions and asked him if he would be able to join in the rescue attempt. The man nodded his head very quickly and told him how to get to the zoo. Grop liked that this man was very friendly, too. He then put the man on the ground and watched in puzzlement as the man ran in precisely the opposite direction. Grop thought about going after him and gently pointing him in the right direction, but something didn't seem right. In fact, it seemed like everybody was running from him and screaming. He hoped he wasn't scaring the poor people. If he was, he'd apologize to them later as well. First things first, he had to rescue his brother. He hurried on down the asphalt, leaving behind a trail of footprints, water main breaks, and wrecked cars. He felt something hit him in the leg. He felt a little tired for a second, but he shrugged it off and continued in what he thought was the general direction of the zoo. Rubeus Hagrid wasn't sure Cornelius, the Cornish pixie, was going to make it. He'd been about to head back home to his brother when Robert Roach had called him and told him that Cornelius was sick. He had immediately dropped everything and headed over to check on the little guy. That had been about 2.5 hours ago. Hagrid still couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and the poor chap looked like he was fading in a hurry. He tried feeding Cornelius some of his favorite foods, but it didn't work. The pixie just shook his head and moaned. He was about to try something more drastic when he heard screams in the distance. All around him, animals started to panic. Deirdre the unicorn squealed in terror, and Cornelius nearly bolted from his cage despite his ill health. Puzzled, he turned to face the commotion. The blood drained from his face. Grop, against all orders, had left the house to come visit. Steam vents were going off all over the place, and there was a cluster of flashing blue lights and fire engines around him. The ground shook each time the giant took a step. He looked a bit sluggish, though. He could hear, even in this distance, the hiss of fire hoses being aimed at his brother. Leaving Cornelius in his cage, there probably wasn't much he could have done anyway. He hurried down the street in Grop's direction. He wasn't hard to find. All he had to do was run in the direction all the Muggles were trying to flee from. He got as close he could before the policemen started shoving him away. Fortunately, it was close enough. He shouted, "Grop, no, absolutely not. Get back in the house, now." Grop shook his head and disturbingly smiled. "No, Hagger. Grop rescue Hagger. Hagger not home, so Grop no Hagger in trouble. Grop nice giant. Grop rescue Hagger. Grop sorry for making people scared, but Grop worry about Hagger." Hagrid swore, "I'm in trouble now, you lumbering ox. Get back in the house." Grop was about to respond when he suddenly stiffened and his eyes glazed over. "Grop tired. Grop want sleepy." With that, the giant lay down in the middle of the street and took a nap. Meanwhile, one of the people in the zoo reported that it had taken a hell of a lot of animal trank to bring him down. He'd probably be asleep for several hours. They debated killing the now unconscious Grop, and Hagrid had to a lot of fast talking to talk them out of it. Hagrid swore vehemently. Turning to the police officers, he said, "I told him not to leave the house specifically because he's only partially civilized and the Muggles aren't ready for him. Get him back in there and lock the door and call an Oblivator. Now." The cops ran off and Hagrid put his head in his hands. What was he going to do now? If Grop was sent back to England or put in prison, who would take care of him? Hagrid was wondering if he would soon have to make a very difficult decision. Chapter 138, Missing Werewolf. May 8, 1996, Transfiguration Office Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Great Britain Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup Albus Dumbledore had thought that actively teaching again would be tricky. Although he was more than familiar with lecturing students in the Great Hall, he hadn't actually taught anyone for over 40 years. He'd been fortunate, however, in that his teaching skills had come back relatively quickly. In the few cases where he wasn't sure what to do, all he had to do was look into his memories in the pensive and see how he'd handled similar situations in the past. The students and staff were reacting to his demotion in wildly different ways. Most of them were supportive and gave him the respect he had earned as the headmaster. Some of them considered him to be the headmaster in all but name and asked him for things which only the headmaster could provide. In situations like this, he would relay the requests to McGonagall, who almost always agreed to them. The headmistress tacitly acknowledged that Dumbledore had been demoted unfairly and that he should be allowed to run the show behind the scenes. She had wanted to nominate him for the position of deputy headmaster, but had been forced to choose Snape instead, as this information would have been visible to the minister. He knew all the students, of course. Having a former principal as your teacher guaranteed that you were going to get well-behaved students. There were, of course, a few Slytherins which acted up in class all the time and started taunting him about time travel. Crabbe had once told him that he'd be able to get his homework done on time if he had access to a time-turner. Pansy Parkinson had learned about the Muggle movies with the DeLorean and promised that she'd be able to work better if she got her broom flying up to 88 mph. Draco, of course, was cocky and confident. He'd been hard to deal with even before the Super Bowl breach. However, something had happened over the past 4 days which made him feel as if he were headmaster himself. Dumbledore had to keep an eye on him. It wouldn't be beyond Voldemort to try to have Draco try to assassinate him, Karkaroff, or Snape. He had just finished off a set of homework assignments when the door to his office banged open. It was Nymphadora Tonks, and she had a frantic look on her face. Something which appeared to be a Muggle newspaper was in her hand. Dumbledore stood up to welcome her. "Good evening, Tonks." "What?" Tonks didn't even wait for him to finish the sentence. Instead, she spoke over him. "Albus, we've got a problem. Remus is missing." Dumbledore frowned. "Missing? What do you mean, missing?" "Missing, as in no one knows where he is. Did you, Scrimgeour, or McGonagall send him on a mission for the Order of the Phoenix?" "No, Tonks, I haven't sent him anywhere. I assumed he was still spending time with you." Tonks gritted her teeth. "He was, until 4 days ago. The last thing he said to me was that he was going to head to Hogwarts to pick up his potion. No one's seen or heard from him since. Dumbledore's brow creased in thought. 4 days ago. That was full moon, right? Tonks nodded. That's right, Albus. Remus disappearing about the time of the full moon is doubly disturbing. I have the horrible suspicion that something prevented him from taking the potion. Dumbledore shook his head. That's impossible. I asked Severus if he had prepared the potion for Remus, and Severus said he had. I had Minerva look into Severus's office later in the day, and the chalice was gone. Combine that with the fact that several students saw Remus in this castle, and your theory doesn't hold water. Tonks drew a deep breath and showed him the Muggle newspaper. If that's the case, how would you explain this? This is from the Sunday edition of the Times, the day after Remus disappeared. Skeptical, Dumbledore looked down at the newspaper. It only took him a few sentences for him to understand what she was concerned about. Rabid dog attacks patrons at Wembley Stadium, bites 28 fans, killing one, before being shot to death by authorities. Animal believed to have been teleported in by evil wizard, possibly Voldemort. Mysterious man seen teleporting into stadium before attack, leaving behind a goblet and a wand. In an incident which could only be characterized as a magical terror attack, an evil wizard teleported a man-sized, rabid dog into Wembley Stadium during last night's game between Arsenal and Manchester United. The creature materialized in Section G and attacked over 24 people before being shot to death by authorities. One of the victims, Terence Silverer, 34, collapsed in the stands and was pronounced dead before he could be taken to the hospital. Witnesses report a man with a thin mustache and receding hairline appearing out of nowhere in Section G and falling down into the seats. The man got up quickly and seemed nervous. He took a look at the sky in the general direction of the moon, which was obscured by clouds at the time. He explained that he had dropped a goblet and needed to retrieve it in a hurry. One of the bite victims, Lauren Mistry, 28, managed to retrieve the goblet, but the man didn't seem content. Authorities suspect that he was still looking for his wand. Witnesses seem to disagree over what happened when the moon came out from behind the cloud. Most of them claim that the man disappeared at that point and teleported the dog in. A few of them claimed that the man had actually transformed into the dog. The Wembley security people, however, dismissed those accounts as having been influenced by the Muggle myths about werewolves. The dog looked and acted much more like a wolf than a typical domestic dog. It was much larger and more vicious than anything people would have normally kept as pets. It was rabid enough to make it attack virtually every human it could get its jaws on. It would have probably gone on to decimate half the stadium had the police not shot it down. Wembley Stadium does not allow patrons to bring pets into the building, and this incident goes to show exactly what they were concerned about. The victims were all treated at the scene and received rabies shots. The Arsenal manager offered to let the staff use the team's locker room as a triage center, where they bound up all of the wounds and sent the people on their way. A few of the victims seemed healthy enough to not need additional help, so they left the stadium after only receiving the rabies shot. The game resumed after a brief delay, and Arsenal eventually defeated Manchester United 1-0. Wembley security personnel widely believe that the man with the mustache was Lord Voldemort. Both the Minister of Magic, Rufus Scrimgeour, and Alliance for Magic politician Tom Riddle admit that an evil wizard named Voldemort exists. They disagree, of course, over who Voldemort's true identity is and are accusing each other of being Voldemort to further their political careers. They have agreed to compare notes and discuss the matter on live television on the afternoon of 8 May. Hopefully, this will give the Prime Minister and other officials a better idea of what to look for. The goblet and the wand were eventually found by the authorities and taken as evidence. Retrieval of the wand was difficult, as it tried to electrocute many of the officials who tried to pick it up. It was eventually scooped up with a souvenir program and placed in a box. For more information, please turn to page 6. Dumbledore put down the paper with trembling hands. He turned to Tonks with a horrified expression on his face. I think I know what happened, Tonks. A Death Eater broke into Hogwarts and turned Snape's chalice into a Portkey. Lupin picked it up to drink it, and it transported him to the stadium before he could do so. He fell down, and his wand and chalice flew out of his hands and into the crowd. The chalice spilled, destroying any chance he had to drink the potion. Lupin knew he couldn't leave the wand behind in a place where it could harm Muggles, so he gambled that he'd be able to find the wand before the moon came out from behind the cloud. Unfortunately, he lost. Tonks looked at him desperately. Does that mean that Remus is? Dumbledore raised his hands in resignation. I'm afraid it does, Tonks. Remus Lupin is dead. We'd better warn the rest of the Order. If there's anything I can do to help, tell me and I'll do my best. However, I believe that something else will have to be our first priority. Oh, and what is that, Albus? He picked up the paper again and pointed at the headline. Remus managed to bite almost 30 people before he went down. 27 survived. I'm not sure if that's bad or good. Tonks frowned. Why is it bad? It's simple, Tonks. Those Muggles are now werewolves, and they have no idea that werewolves exist. 1 month from now, they will transform and start biting more people. Those people, in turn, will also become werewolves. If each werewolf bites 10 more people each month before being taken out. Tonks put her hands to her head. Merlin's beard. Exponential growth. Voldemort has triggered a werewolf pandemic among the Muggles, and they don't realize that the rabies shots aren't going to prevent it. Dumbledore closed his eyes. Exactly, Tonks. We need to think of something, and we've got less than a month to do it. I think we need to talk to the Prime Minister. We also need to get Lupin's wand back. Depending on what the Muggles do with it, it could do more harm in a month than the werewolves would have been able to. Chapter 139. A Very Short Debate. May 8, 1996, BBC Headquarters, London, England. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Voldemort was ecstatic. The Ministry of Magic had caved in and agreed to a meeting. In all fairness, though, he couldn't imagine how they could have refused. Refusal would have been tantamount to them conceding that they were wrong and he was right. From the Muggle perspective, that would have been equivalent to a declaration that Scrimgeour was the Dark Lord and that the Muggles should support Tom Riddle. He was very close now to becoming Prime Minister, or at least in control of what John Major's policies would be. Voldemort had demanded that he, Scrimgeour, and the Prime Minister meet on live television to discuss who exactly Voldemort was. Although he was fairly certain that he would be able to imperious both Major and Scrimgeour before they went on the air, he wanted to be certain. So, he'd instructed one of the Sri Lankan Death Eaters recruited by Dilmy to hide under an invisibility cloak. If things got out of hand, his orders were to stun Scrimgeour and the Prime Minister while hiding under the cloak. Voldemort, in his guise as the politician Tom Riddle, would appear to bury the hatchet and rescue both men. Of course, the rescue would happen to fail, forcing him to be remorseful on television. It would be good publicity, at the very least. The debate with Scrimgeour wasn't the only plan which was starting to pay dividends. He'd managed to take control of Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia, Hamas, and Hezbollah. That put him in a position to wreak havoc in Israel and potentially control a lot of oil. Another of the Indians had reported that he had been able to kidnap a North Korean and grab a few of the man's hairs to add to a polyjuice potion. Disguised as the Korean, the Indian was planning to go to Kim Jong-il and try to start manipulating North Korea as well. North Korea was a very tempting target. It was centered on a tradition of leader worship, which would help him greatly. And it also supposedly had a lot of uranium, which could conceivably be used to create nuclear weapons. He wasn't sure if the country had enough weaponized uranium to produce a weapon at this point. However, all they needed was one pure sample, and he'd be able to engorgio and geminio it to his heart's delight. As if that weren't enough, his associates in Al-Qaeda had told him that they were within a week of attempting the attack on the American Department of Magic and blaming everything on America for humans if it failed. The werewolf pandemic had already been kicked off, with Draco risking life and limb to turn Snape's chalice into a Portkey. Draco was proving to be a smart and resilient young man. Voldemort suspected that he would have the determination and discipline necessary to kill off Snape. First things first, however, he had to get through this interview. Right now, he was alone in a Muggle office, thinking about what exactly he was going to do. Lucius had once again let him borrow his George cross for this meeting. He was dressed in his best robes and had enchanted the George cross so that it glowed brightly. There was a knock on the door, followed by a tentative, "Mr. Riddle, we're just about ready. I'd like to come in to tell you how exactly this is going to work. Is it all right?" Making sure that the Indian was hidden under the invisibility cloak, Voldemort turned to the door and spoke with confidence. "Fine with me, sir. Come on in." The door opened, and a man came in carrying a large metal box. Much to Voldemort's chagrin, it wasn't the Prime Minister. It looked like John Major had just sent some low-level flunky as a messenger. Voldemort considered imperiusing the visitor for a moment, but decided against it. If Major found out, he'd be in a lot of trouble. The flunky shook his hand and began to explain. "All right, this is what we're going to do. First, I'd like you to relinquish your wand and place it in this box. We know that Voldemort exists, but we don't know what his real name is. For all we know, it could be you." The Prime Minister suspects that Voldemort would attempt to disrupt this meeting using magic. Consequently, both you and Minister Scrimgeour will enter the room at the same time, alone and unarmed. Alarm bells rang in Voldemort's head, and he glanced towards the invisible Indian. He suspected a trap, although Major probably didn't know that Tom Riddle and Voldemort were the same person. Scrimgeour certainly would have. Would Scrimgeour have been above imperiusing the Prime Minister to climb off the fence of impartiality and make sure that Voldemort exposed himself? It was something worth considering. He had to be on guard. For the time being, however, he had to play politics. He nodded to the flunky. "I understand, sir. The Prime Minister is a very wise man. You can have my wand provided that I can get it back at the end of the meeting." With that, he pulled out his wand and dropped it in the box. He personally didn't need a wand, of course, if Dilmy's friend was going to do the dirty work for him. The flunky thanked him and put the box under his shoulder. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Riddle. When I give the signal, you are to step out of this alcove and into the main conference room. There you will see Scrimgeour, the Prime Minister, and a neutral wizard who has volunteered to serve as a moderator." The Prime Minister assumed that there would be no way for a Muggle to mediate between two opposing wizards, even without wands, so he brought in neutral wizard. Voldemort didn't like this at all. It was just supposed to be the three of them. This wizard would likely be armed and could interfere with the plan. He glanced quickly at the veiled Indian and was rewarded by a quick tap on the floor under the invisibility cloak. Voldemort recognized the signal immediately. Unspoken acknowledgement that the Indian would take out the wizard if necessary. Turning back to the flunky, Voldemort said, "That's not a bad idea. I should have thought of it myself. Who's going to be the moderator?" "Mr. Riddle. The moderator will be Grand Mugwump, Anastasios Dialonis of the International Confederation of Wizards." Voldemort froze momentarily. This was getting very dangerous. Dialonis was the highest-ranking wizard in the world. As a member of the Iqua, he was indeed neutral and realistic choice for a moderator. However, Voldemort would have bet his bottom galleon that Dialonis knew who he was. And what was worse was that every wizard on the planet recognized Dialonis's authority. There was no way his Indian sidekick would be able to attack Dialonis without risking a major international incident. Dialonis was the equivalent of the head of the United Nations in the Muggle world. He bet that Dialonis had brought some guards along hidden under cloaks like the Indians, and was going to be armed. An attack on the Grand Mugwump would probably have ripple effects throughout the world. Death Eaters would come under extreme scrutiny worldwide. He suspected that virtually every country with a ministry of magic would put a price on the heads of every Voldemort supporter they could find. His entire international organization would fall apart in a hurry. If he simply admitted he was Voldemort, Diolanus would likely leave England alone and go back to Atlantis. He would probably be killed, but he could always come back. If he succeeded in convincing the world that Scrimgeour was Voldemort, he'd come out ahead and would likely be the Prime Minister of at least Minister of Magic. If he protested Diolanus's interference, the Ichor would come down on him and probably send officials to knock out every single Death Eater on the planet. A Muggle expression from the game of poker came to mind. Voldemort had been pretty certain he had the better hand and had raised the stakes to include all of England. Scrimgeour, however, had surprised him by coming over the top and going all in. Was Scrimgeour bluffing? Was Voldemort willing to commit all his chips to call? He had to say something and do so quickly. For the time being, he'd play along. That's not a bad idea, actually. He'll work out pretty well. I'm surprised, though, that he got involved with what was believed to be a regional dispute. I doubt Voldemort is known outside the British Isles. The flunky shrugged. Supposedly, the Minister of Magic can call upon the Ichor whenever he wants someone to serve as an impartial mediator. I guess Scrimgeour had the right to ask for the Grand Mugwump. I'm not a wizard, though. Now, if you would excuse me, I've got to talk to Scrimgeour. With that, the wizard left, leaving Voldemort alone with his thoughts. 5 minutes later, a bell rang. Voldemort took a deep breath, asked the Indian to follow him, and headed into the main conference room to meet Scrimgeour. Much to his surprise, the door closed immediately after he went through it, leaving the armed Indian on the other side. Shit, Voldemort thought. He supposed the Indian could apparate into the room, but the wizards would probably see that, and the Muggles would get very suspicious if that door opened seemingly of its own accord. Television cameras were everywhere, forcing Voldemort to shield his eyes. He could make out 3 people in the room who weren't trying to attack him with photographic equipment. He recognized Rufus Scrimgeour coming in from an adjacent office. Scrimgeour looked at him with absolute hatred. Voldemort knew what his opponent was thinking. I've got you now, Voldemort. It's a pity I can't take advantage of it on live television because of the power base you're gaining among the Muggles. Seated at the table were 2 men. Voldemort recognized the Prime Minister, dressed in an expensive black suit. Next to him, as Voldemort had feared, was Diolanus. It took several minutes for the television cameras to finish taking shots. Finally, Diolanus stood and addressed the media. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Grand Mugwump Anastasios Diolanus, head of the International Confederation of Wizards. My position is equivalent to that of the head of your United Nations. I, as a neutral observer who is not English, have been called upon to mediate this debate between Tom Riddle and Rufus Scrimgeour. A serious look then crossed Diolanus's face. However, there is one thing we must do before we get started. As you are aware, there have been awful stories about an evil British wizard named Voldemort who has been terrorizing the country of late. We know he exists, but no one seems to know who he is. Each of these 2 esteemed wizards believes the other person could be Voldemort, and I can't blame them. However, there is an easy way for us to figure this out. Diolanus lifted his wand and cast a spell. His hands started to glow brightly. I am going to require that everyone here take the following unbreakable vow. I state your name, will answer the following question truthfully. I am not Lord Voldemort. I will then ask each person if he is Lord Voldemort. He will be forced to speak the truth. Otherwise, the unbreakable vow will kill him. I don't like unbreakable vows all that much, but that was the only thing we could think of here which couldn't be outwitted. Voldemort swore to himself and watched as a small grin flitted across Scrimgeour's face. He was screwed, and Scrimgeour knew it. He would have to refuse the vow, in which case everyone would get suspicious. He could take the vow and lie, which would get him temporarily killed. He'd come back, but the Muggles would never listen to him again. He could try to escape before taking the vow, but that would force him to leave without his wand. He wouldn't be able to get his wand on the way out, because the flunky with the box was not in the room, and an attempt to apparate over to get the wand would be seen by all. He had only one chance. He had to make sure no one started making unbreakable vows. Calming himself the best he could, he said, "Unbreakable vows. Do you really think unbreakable vows are necessary, Grand Mugwump? What about Veritaserum?" Dialonis shook his head. "That won't work, Mr. Riddle. Veritaserum can be mentally fought, like any other truth-enforcing mechanism, and I suspect Voldemort is more than powerful enough to fight Veritaserum. The unbreakable vow is the only way to go. Now, pushing right along." He then pointed to his hand and cast the spell. "I, Anastasios Dialonis, will answer the following question truthfully. I am not Lord Voldemort." The Prime Minister then turned to him and asked him if he was Voldemort. Dialonis said he was not. The Grand Mugwump then turned to Rufus Scrimgeour. "Mr. Scrimgeour, will you please extend your hand?" Scrimgeour did so and waited for Dialonis to cast the spell. "I, Rufus Scrimgeour, will answer the following question truthfully. I am not Lord Voldemort." Dialonis stared hard at Scrimgeour. "Mr. Scrimgeour, are you Lord Voldemort?" Scrimgeour shook his head. "No, I am not Lord Voldemort." Dialonis nodded and walked towards Voldemort. "Mr. Riddle, would you please extend your hand?" Gritting his teeth, Voldemort did so. Dialonis cast the unbreakable vow. "Repeat after me. I, Tom Riddle, will answer the following question truthfully. I am not Lord Voldemort." Voldemort got careful here. He had to speak very precisely here. He just hoped no one would pick it up. "I, Tom Riddle, will answer the following question truthfully. I am not Lord Voldemort." Dialonis looked at him with a small grin on his face. "Are you Lord Voldemort?" Voldemort braced himself as he spoke. "No, I am not Lord Voldemort." The plan was elegant. He had never sworn to answer the Lord Voldemort question truthfully. He had sworn to answer the Lord Voldemort question truthfully. FV's V, they sounded the same and could easily be interchanged unless people were looking for it, and he doubted the Muggles would pick it up. Scrimgeour looked at him in shock. Voldemort shrugged magnanimously. "Don't worry about it, Minister. Everyone makes mistakes." The Prime Minister, however, was staring daggers at him. "Indeed they do, Mr. Riddle. You didn't pronounce the Dark Lord's name right. You said Voldemort. I heard that the question that you swore to answer was not the one the Grand Mugwump asked. You cheated, Mr. Riddle." "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we know who Voldemort is now, don't we?" The rest of the people in the room started to mutter as cameras flashed. Voldemort, however, wasn't focusing on them. Swearing incoherently, he apparated out of the room, leaving a stunned audience behind. Dialonis looked at where Voldemort had been standing for a few minutes. Then he shrugged and got up. "Well, I think that's that. I think my job here is done." Scrimgeour chuckled. "Indeed, Grand Mugwump, it is. I can't help but say, Lord Voldemort definitely effed that one up." Chapter 140. North Korea Infiltrated. May 9, 1996, Presidential Palace Pyongyang, North Korea. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup, Kim Jong-il like Chief Executive Officer Sue. He'd thought the man was bright, and Sue hadn't disappointed him. He had been thinking of nominating him to be the interim Minister of Magic, until he found a wizard capable of fulfilling that position. Sue had finally figured out what that Geminio spell did. It made a second copy of an object. When applied to a human being, it would create an inanimate clone of the being which looked exactly like a dead body. This spell would be useful for his ultimate Korean army, as people would lower their guard once they thought one of his officers was finally dead. Unfortunately, the bad guys could do that as well. Sue had gone through some of the footage on Choi Yoon's farm's cameras and made the startling discovery that the witch wasn't dead. She had defected to the south. The dear leader had promptly ordered Sue to destroy the defector's farm and kill everyone who could have come into contact with her. It wasn't a major loss, as Sue had already managed to sprinkle a few wizards among the neighboring farms to boost their productivity with magic. The destruction of Choi Yoon's farm had proven problematic, however. It appeared that there had been a couple of other wizards hiding out in there as well, and those too had violently disagreed with his decision. This disagreement featured incidents such as the tossing of a tank into a river. The Air Force had been forced to take the wizards out with a supersonic missile, virtually the only thing which would kill them before they found out about the threat. Only then was he able to safely annihilate the farm. Judging from the reports from his commanders, nothing was going to be able to grow there for at least 20 years. A close examination of what was left of the two bodies after the attack revealed papers tying them to South Korea. It seemed like there were defectors everywhere. If the South had wizards who would listen to their government, he needed to match their forces and hopefully exceed them. And he needed to ensure that they would stay loyal to him. He bluntly told Sue to go find someone who'd support him and tell him to bring his friends. The dear leader hadn't had high hopes for this, but amazingly, the man had pulled it off. Sue had just entered his office, along with a man he'd never seen before named Moon Jai Jai. The man seemed to be in his early 40s and unusually healthy for a peasant. Moon Jai bowed to him. "Your Excellency, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Moon Jai, and I belong to a group of wizards who is willing to work for you in exchange for a position in your inner circle." Kim Jong-il looked at him skeptically. "That would be great if it were actually true. Why should I trust you? For all we know, you could have ensorcelled Sue over there and convinced him that you were trustworthy. You wouldn't be the first South Korean defector who tried to take over up here." Moon Jai nodded. "Your Excellency, you are a wise man. I admit that my claim seems outrageous and that your skepticism is justified given what Sue told me has already happened to you. However, I am willing to seal my future to yours with an unbreakable vow." "Unbreakable vow, Your Excellency. It's a spell which forces the subject to fulfill a vow under penalty of death." The dear leader turned to Sue. "Sue, you've spoken with wizards before. Have you ever heard of an unbreakable vow?" Sue shook his head. "I'm afraid not, Your Excellency. However, I'm not a wizard. It's quite possible it exists and I don't know about it. However, there may be an easy way to tell." He reached into his pocket and brought out Choi Yoon's old spellbook. It may have been damaged in the conflagration she used to fake her death, but I sent it to a specialist, and he managed to restore most of the text. If it's in there, we'll find it. Wizard Moon Jai, would you be able to recognize the unbreakable oath if you saw it in here? The wizard nodded. "Absolutely, Chief Executive Officer Sue. It's a relatively simple spell. Let me take a look at it." Sue glanced briefly at the dear leader, who nodded. The former overseer then handed the book to the wizard, who began rummaging through the pages. Midway through the book, he took a close look at one of the pages and stabbed his finger at the text. "I thought so. Here it is." Kim Jong-il asked to see the book, and the wizard handed it over. Sure enough, he could make out the words "unbreakable vow" in the text. It was followed by a shot of a wand hovering over a glowing hand. He whistled. "I'll be damned, there is in fact an unbreakable vow in there. All right, Moon Jai, go ahead and cast your spell. That will be good enough for me." The wizard nodded and asked for permission to recover his wand from the guards. The dear leader granted it. Once Moon Jai had the wand, he muttered something and pointed it to his left hand, which started to glow. The wizard then spoke clearly and precisely. "I, Moon Jai, vow that I will do whatever I can to support the dear leader of North Korea. So be it." Sue whistled as the glow spread around the wizard's hands. He turned to the dear leader and chuckled. "Hey, if that thing works on Muggles, we may have found a way to prevent them from defecting." Moon Jai nodded and rubbed his hands. It will work, Chief Executive Officer. However, you'll need a wizard to cast the spell. I'll be able to do that. My friends and I should be able to help you a great deal. The dear leader got a bit wary at this. You and I both know that I don't have that many friends among the lower classes. They fear me and admire me, but they don't necessarily love me. What's in it for you? Moon Jai shrugged. We wizards have traditionally lived lives independent from the Muggles, Your Excellency. We've seen how the people here suffer. We believe that if we help with the Muggles' living conditions, they're less likely to defect and more likely to help you voluntarily. We're doing this for the people, Your Excellency. Although one wizard like myself will be able to help, even I won't be able to improve an entire country. From what Sue here told me of the defector, she and I had more or less the same idea. I, however, won't be going anywhere. And neither will my friends once we administer this vow. The dear leader's skepticism faded. Spoken like a true patriot, my friend. How many of people are in your group? Moon Jai thought for a moment. Absently, he reached into his pocket. Sue and the dear leader got a bit nervous for a second, but he brought out what appeared to be a vial of some sort and drank it. Noticing the expression on the other two men's faces, the wizard explained, "Homeopathic antacid medication. I get a lot of heartburn, so I have to take this once every hour to keep it at bay." Putting away the vial, the wizard answered the question. "I'd say we've got at least 50 wizards already who will support you, Your Excellency. I suspect that once the country realizes what we're doing, the wizards will come out of the woodwork to get involved and try to get onto our steering committee." The dear leader smiled. "You get the ball rolling, and the people will maintain its momentum. You've done a good job, Secretary Sue of the National Muggle Relations Committee, and you, Minister of Magic Moon Jai." Both men smiled as they processed their promotions. "Thank you, Your Excellency. We will do our best to serve you." Chapter 141, Muslims for Humans. May 9, 1996, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Jerusalem. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. Samuel, along with his ever-present interpreter, stared in shock at the Kohen Gadol. "You mean to tell me they've got another sect now?" The Kohen Gadol raised his hands in resignation. "I'm afraid so, Holy One. They call themselves the Celestine Catholic Church. They've broken off from the main Catholic Church, the one in Rome. Those are the people who honor the prophet who was executed, and not the Arabian one, right? This is the group John Paul is in charge of." "Half right, Holy One. They are indeed operating under the mistaken assumption that Jesus of Nazareth was the last prophet. However, they no longer consider John Paul to be their leader. They have chosen a man named Celestine Roman VI to be their leader." "What was wrong with John Paul? He seems to be a reasonable man, and he agreed to listen to us. The only thing I found troubling was that statue in the courtyard inn. What was that city called? Rome. I recommended that he take it away, because people may get the wrong impression that we worship idols." The Kohen Gadol stared intently at his feet. "From what I've been told, Celestine Roman VI was reluctant to follow John Paul's order to give up his icons. Many of the churches in that area rely on icons to inspire people, and they know that the icons are not intended to be idols. They thought it would be inappropriate to restrict icon usage, and that's what got Celestine irritated." Samuel stared at him. "They can keep their icons if they just put warnings outside the front door warning people that they're not to be taken as idols." The Kohen Gadol shook his head. "That may be what he intended. However, things have taken a bizarre turn. For one thing, Celestine Roman VI doubts you are who you say you are. He doesn't think you're the man from the Bible." "The Bible? The Judeo-Christian holy book, Holy One. I believe you've been given a copy." "Yes, Your Holiness, I have. So far, I've gotten through what you call Leviticus. It looks all right to me. I haven't seen anything unusual yet." "That's because the first 5 books were already more or less finalized by the time you were born. The later books, however, are new to you. They include Joshua, Judges. The cone Gadol froze. He didn't want to say what the next two books were. Samuel probably would have had a heart attack if he had still been alive. Samuel cut in. Joshua, I've heard of. He was the commander-in-chief of the Israelites when they began their campaign against Canaan. I think one of my great-grandparents served in his army. I don't remember any judges, though. I remember a bunch of warlords who squabbled for control shortly after the initial occupation, though. You're telling me that I appear in this book as well. That makes no sense. Who do they think I am, Moses? It was time for a change of topic, the cone Gadol thought. We can deal with who's in the book later. Let's get back to the Celestines. The Celestines revere the Samuel mentioned in the Bible. However, they doubt your claim that you and the man from the Bible are the same person. They complained that John Paul was being influenced by an impostor and started their own sect. This turned the Celestines against both you and John Paul. Samuel looked furious. I'll excommunicate him. That will solve the problem. Everyone will listen to me. They won't obey the excommunication order because they won't recognize your authority. All right, you excommunicate them. You're the cone Gadol. They won't listen to me because I'm a Muslim. I revere Mohammed and they don't. But John Paul does. They don't follow John Paul, they follow Celestine. Samuel gaped at him and then muttered something which the interpreter delicately refused to translate. The prophet's tone of voice, however, was obvious. The cone Gadol shook his head sadly. I know it sounds bad. Unfortunately, it is. Many Celestines joined the new sect because the sect quickly turned against wizards to differentiate itself from the traditional Catholics. They believe wizards are the allies of Shaitan, the adversary. The fact that both you and John Paul are wizards just served as an excuse to make the Celestines into an anti-wizard movement. In general, the Celestines are more conservative than traditional Catholics. They're even against evolution. Samuel looked at him blankly. The cone Gadol swore under his breath. Evolution is the process we believe Allah used to create life forms during the 6 days of creation. We don't know how Allah did it, of course, but we think we've discovered one of his tools. The point is, the Celestines and Roman Catholics are diverging very rapidly. It's going to take a miracle to reconcile the two at the rate things are going. Samuel was about to say something when the cone Gadol heard a knock on the door. Excusing himself for a moment, he opened the door and saw one of his aides standing before him. The man had a document in his hand and an ashen look on his face. The cone Gadol stared at him in concern. Ibrahim, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a jinn. The visitor shook his head and handed the cone Gadol the document. The high priest looked it over briefly, and his eyes widened. Muslims for humans. What in the name of Allah is Muslims for humans? I doubt this is being done in the name of Allah, holiness. Muslims for humans is an anti-wizard movement which appears to have just taken off in Saudi Arabia. It seems that a few people are a bit irritated that King Fahd has taken on a wizard as an advisor. They claim that the wizard is going to cause the downfall of the kingdom because he is a Hindu wizard. The group is violently against all Hindus and wizards, especially those with one or more Muggle parents. Many of them have tattooed a symbol on their arms with a snake and skull on it. Even most astonishing, there are both Sunnis and Shiites in their midst. The cone Gadol swore to himself, just what we need right now. I was just telling Samuel about those nut jobs in the Ukraine. Why isn't Fahd doing anything about them? Ibrahim stared in the general direction of Samuel. I don't know. That's something a lot of people want to find out. Fahd's the king, and he's got a wizard on his cabinet. They've certainly got the power and authority to do something about it, yet for some reason they're not. Many of my Saudi friends are a bit uneasy about this. Perhaps Rickpreet thinks that as long as they don't have wizards, which would be unlikely given their nature, they aren't really a threat, and for the time being they're a rather small movement. Are they associated with the Celestines in some way? Could they be trying to initiate another crusade by playing off some people's fear of wizards? Samuel is not going to like this. Ibrahim looked at Samuel for a moment. No, I don't think he is. We've already got a problem with Celestine Christians. Can you imagine what Celestine Muslims would be like? For one thing, they probably won't listen to you, which means another sect from Samuel's perspective. The Cone Gadol shook his head. May Allah forbid that. Ibrahim looked thoughtfully at Samuel. Inshallah, he will do so. However, if this is the harbinger of the end of days, we would expect the Mahdi at any minute now, wouldn't we? And even if it weren't the end of days, Allah would need to send a great man in order to clean all of this haram up. The Cone Gadol turned back to look at Samuel, who was looking at the people praying in the main sanctuary below. He paused and thought about it for a moment. I'll tell Samuel, who will probably excommunicate the whole movement. Much good that would do. However, as far as the Mahdi is concerned, indeed, Ibrahim, we would be expecting the Mahdi, and it would make sense for Allah, praise be unto him, to send him now. Chapter 142. A Hit on Jelena Kurchatova. May 10, 1996. Al-Qaeda headquarters location, classified Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. There was a knock on the door leading to the head of Al-Qaeda's inner sanctum. Damn it, Harun Dilmi, the Death Eater who had become the head of the terrorist organization, looked up from his prepared speech to the man standing in the entrance. Sir, Ms. Afia Siddiqui is here. She's been with me the entire time, as I have been serving as her chaperone. She claims she has an appointment with you. Is that true? Dilmi nodded. He'd almost forgotten about her, which was a bad sign. The young woman did not realize it, but she would likely be playing a pivotal role in Al-Qaeda's next operation, assuming, of course, that the Western powers refused to accept their ultimatum. He said, "Yes, send her in. I'll serve as her chaperone while she's in here. You can wait outside, as this is top-secret business." The visitor saluted, turned on his heel, and headed back out into the reception room. 10 seconds later, he returned with a modestly clad woman trailing at his heels. She appeared to be barely out of her teens. The woman seemed nervous. Dilmi couldn't blame her. She was going to speaking to the head of Al-Qaeda and to a wizard to boot. There were a lot of people who were afraid of wizards already, including those rabble-rousers Rikpreet had started up in Saudi Arabia under the Imperiust blessing of King Fahd. Siddiqui, however, had no reason to fear him, provided that she was able to do her duty, of course. She was untested, as far as he knew. This would be a good first test. The man indicated the woman. "Mr. Dilmi, this is Afia Siddiqui, a new recruit. Ms. Siddiqui, this Adamad Harun Dilmi, head of Al-Qaeda. Disobey him at your peril." The woman trembled for a moment, but composed herself. "I understand, sir." Dilmi looked at her slowly and nodded. "It's good you do, young woman, because any hesitation here could cost you dearly. All right, Said. You can go now. I'll take it from here. Close the soundproof doors behind you on the way out." The visitor saluted once more and left. Dilmi waited until he saw the doors close behind Said. Satisfied with his secrecy, he turned to the woman. "Ms. Siddiqui, I have a mission for you. If you succeed, you will make our next operation much safer and potentially much easier." The woman took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. "I live for Al-Qaeda, Mr. Dilmi. How can I help you?" Dilmi reached into his desk and pulled out a folder. There was a name on the cover along with a photograph. He showed the folder to the new operative. "Do you recognize this woman, Miss Siddiqui?" Siddiqui looked at the photograph for a moment. "She looks vaguely familiar, but I can't place her. Should I know her, sir?" Dilmi breathed a sigh of relief. She didn't know the mark, which was a good sign. Operatives often had difficulty assassinating friends. However, he kept his face dispassionate. "Possibly. She went to school with you. She is a year behind you, I believe, so she's a senior. She lives in Russian House, and her name is written here on the folder. However, you may be interested to know that people have been referring to her as the Russian House Witch." Siddiqui frowned. Russian house. I didn't really know anyone in Russian house, sir. There were a couple of people in my dorm who may have, however. I know of one girl named Felicia who was dating someone in Geontry, so she was in MacGregor a lot. I think she was involved with Hillel and knew several Hillel students in Russian house. Dilmy's eyebrows shot up. The polyjuice potion would work on Muggles, as far as he knew. If Siddiqui were able to kidnap this woman and polyjuice into her, she could conceivably do what Barty Crouch Jr. did with Alistair Moody. That would give her access to Russian house through the Hillel students, and it would get people pissed at Jews to boot. Very interesting. However, there was one important thing to check, though. Is this Felicia woman still at Met? Siddiqui shook her head. No, sir, she was my year. What about her boyfriend? A year ahead of me. His name was. Dilmy cut her off irritably. There went that idea. Forget that I brought it up, Miss Siddiqui. At any rate, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this woman out using any means possible. You must do so before the 14th and make it look like an accident. Siddiqui froze. He couldn't see under the burqa, but he was fairly certain that her face had gone white. You want me to assassinate a practicing witch? Dilmy nodded. That is correct, young lady. You have access to MIT, and people will not question you if you're seen in the dorms. You can argue that you've come back to visit friends. I've been told that Russian house is connected to two other dorms, MacGregor House and New House, by a corridor. Is that the case? Siddiqui nodded. Yes, it is. Technically, Russian house is considered part of New House 1, one of the 6 subdivisions of New House. Did you have any friends in the other subdivisions of New House, Miss Siddiqui? Siddiqui nodded slowly. Yes. Good, you've got yourself an alibi. You were visiting friends and happened to be in the area at the time. Once you're in New House, can you get into Russian house? Siddiqui shook her head. No, sir. Each of the subdivisions has its own lock system. I can get into New House as a whole, but I need to let someone let me into Russian house. Dilmy nodded and reached into his desk. He had prepared for this eventuality. Grinning, he pulled a knife out of the desk and passed it, hilt first, to the operative. Siddiqui looked at it, baffled. You want me to use this knife to do the deed? Dilmy shook his head. You probably won't want to get close enough to her to finish her off with the knife. Besides, the knife isn't supposed to be used to kill. It's a magical object which will allow you to break the lock of any door. Siddiqui understood immediately. In other words, I can get into Russian house once I've gotten into New House to visit my friend, and if necessary, into this girl's room. Exactly. Once you're in there, get the job done and get out of there. I don't care how you do it as long as she's dead by the 14th. We don't want her anywhere near MacGregor, especially Irontree that day. What do you say? Siddiqui was silent for a moment. Dilmy wondered whether he'd pushed her too hard, too fast. Making no sudden movements, he reached for his wand. He didn't want this woman turning on him at this critical juncture. Finally, the woman's shoulders slumped. Shuddering, she took the knife. All right, I'll do it. Good for you, Miss Siddiqui. I know it's hard for you. However, once you're done with this first assignment, the others should come more easily. Good luck, young woman. May Allah be with you. Now head back into the anteroom where Said will rejoin you. Be advised that your mission is top secret. Don't tell anyone about it. Siddiqui composed herself as she headed towards the exit. I'll keep the secret, so may Allah be with you as well. He waited for the woman to leave. Once she had left, he turned back to the document he was about to send Al Jazeera. -10, May 1996. This message is from Damad Haran Dilmy, the head of the brave band of freedom fighters known as Al-Qaeda. We have been excited, yet disturbed, by several of the momentous events which have taken place over the past few months. Fortunately, Al-Qaeda now has the power to ensure that the Western world listens to our demands. I, Damad Haran Dilmy, am a wizard committed to jihad. I am not alone in this organization. There are several wizards in our community, all of whom have decided to use their powers to further Allah's vision for mankind. We at Al-Qaeda are not fond of hurting people. However, when people are endangering their lives and civilization by risking the wrath of Allah, what are we supposed to do? After discussion with my colleagues, we have decided to issue a warning to the United States and all other nations which have been involved in the Judeo-Christian crusade against the true faith. We at Al-Qaeda have concluded that we have no choice but to attack the United States on its home soil using a powerful, magic-enhanced weapon. If successful, this operation will likely result in the deaths of thousands of people. It will occur within a week. We will call off the attack if the United States accepts the following terms. First, America is to withdraw any support for so-called Israel and begin divesting from the Zionist country. All American citizens and funds are to leave Israel by the beginning of 1997. Second, America is to ensure that no infidels transgress upon the Temple Mount. By infidel, I mean anyone who is not a Muslim. The imam in charge of the Al-Aqsa Mosque is to be replaced, if possible, with a man who will not betray the faith. Jews are also not to be permitted to worship at the Western Wall. Third, Arab supporters of the United States must create councils of wizards which will eventually take control of the government from the Muggles. All members of these councils must be practicing Muslim wizards. Each jihadist wizard on the council will earn that country $50 million in pure gold. Finally, wizards who have one or more Muggle parents should identify themselves to national authorities so that they can be recruited to join these ruling committees. I understand these terms are harsh and that they will be difficult to implement. Unfortunately, we at Al-Qaeda feel like we have no choice. It is better for a few thousand people to suffer than for millions of people to die when the last judgment comes. May Allah grant you the wisdom to accept these demands. I look forward to a favorable reply. Chapter 143, Oil Embargo. May 10, 1996, 4 days to Siddiqui deadline. Ministry of Magicrub Al-Khala Saudi Arabia Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. Haydar Dagher looked up as the man entered the room. Minister, we've got a problem. Dagher rubbed his eyes. He'd been having trouble sleeping of late with all of the recent events. Tell me something I don't know. What are we dealing with now? Dilmi's ultimatum, or those tattooed maniacs who think they're speaking for Allah? The subordinate's response disheartened, yet didn't surprise Dagher. Neither, Minister. What in Allah's name happened now? Needless to say, I'm a bit swamped at the moment. Can't it wait? The subordinate shook his head. I'm afraid not, Minister. You see, it involves the king. The king's been acting a bit strange. Dagher's jaw dropped. You mean to tell me the king's got a problem now? What's going on? The subordinate groaned. Well, the king just made an announcement which most of his cabinet seemed to think was a bit inappropriate. Inappropriate? What do you mean? He said something which is probably going to get the whole kingdom in trouble. I wouldn't be surprised if America tries to intervene in our government and oust him. Dagher shook his head violently. America ousting Fard? Why in Allah's name would they do that? We've got reasonable relations with the US. We give them oil, after all. The subordinate was blunt. Not anymore, after this decree. Dagher put both his hands on his head. Fard declared an embargo against the United States. The subordinate showed him a piece of parchment. You can read the text of the speech right here. He has decided to suspend all oil exports to countries who allow non-Muslim citizens to worship at Al-Aqsa. The decree will take effect on June 1st. Dagher grabbed the document and looked over the text of the king's decree. The subordinate had summed it up quite nicely. The Minister of Magic shook in horror. Is His Majesty mad? No, let me rephrase that. Is he senile? The subordinate shook his head. I don't think so, Minister. My guess is that he's been imperiused. It took Dagher a good 30 seconds to realize what he was implying. You think this Rickpreet is controlling the king? The subordinate nodded. I'm afraid so, Minister. Fard started acting strange almost immediately after Rickpreet, a known wizard, joined his staff. We've also done some research on this fellow. Supposedly he's friends with a man named Lucius Malfoy. He used to work with Malfoy in the British Ministry of Magic. Dagger nodded. I'm familiar with Wizard Malfoy. He's supposedly an ally of the kingdom. He offered to help after our man was assassinated by Dilmy during Dilmy's takeover of Al-Qaeda. The subordinate grimaced. I'm starting to think that Malfoy isn't friendly. There are reports coming out of Britain that used to tie him to Lord Voldemort, a powerful dark wizard who tried to take over the government back in the late 1970s. He lay low for a while and recently re-emerged as the British political candidate Tom Riddle. The British Minister of Magic, Rufus Scrimgeour, challenged Riddle to a debate. Riddle accepted, not realizing that Scrimgeour had convinced Delantis to come in to mediate. Delantis required both parties to take unbreakable vows to say they weren't Voldemort, and that outed Riddle as Voldemort. Voldemort apparated away before anyone could capture him. The Brits thought that they had managed to capture his wand, but the wand mysteriously disappeared a few minutes after Voldemort disappeared. I get the impression Voldemort brought an accomplice. Dagger stared at him. Atlantis intervened, but I thought Atlantis was supposed to stay neutral in regional crises like this. It is, Minister, and the Grand Mugwump agreed only to mediate. However, the fact that Delantis intervened personally in this incident gives me the impression that Atlantis is starting to watch what's going on here more carefully. We're getting Voldemort and Death Eater connections popping up in various countries now. There are rumors that Damned Haran Dilmy, the head of Al-Qaeda, is former Voldemort supporter. Dagger gasped. You mean this Voldemort character has gone international and has got tentacles in us and Al-Qaeda, and he just barely missed an opportunity to become Prime Minister of England? Correct, Minister. And judging from what Fard's schedule has been like over the past few weeks, I suspect Hamas and Hezbollah as well. He's got control over most of the volatile elements of the Middle East at this point. I'm getting the impression that Voldemort may even be linked to those nutcases behind Muslims for humans. Dagher was furious. No dark wizard was going to wreck the kingdom while he was in power in Saudi Arabia. He swore it to Allah. He screamed at the top of his lungs so everyone in the building could hear him. Attention, everyone. Get over here now for an emergency meeting. We need to get rid of Amram Rickpreet and do it within 72 hours. Drop everything. This is critical. Bill Clinton stared at his foreign policy advisor. You're sure about this? The advisor nodded. I'm afraid so, Mr. President. Fard has done a 180 and seems to have been influenced by those loonies in Muslims for Humans. Clinton shook his head. First Dilmy's ultimatum and now this. The whole Middle East is starting to go bonkers. Secretary Radner, what are your thoughts? Travis Radner looked gravely at him. I suspect we've got an international organization here, Mr. President. A Briton known as Tom Riddle, widely believed to be a dark wizard known as Lord Voldemort, was trying to get a Muggle power base to make a bid for the Prime Minister of England. He could be behind it. He had a lot of followers back in the 70s and early 80s. If I were the British Ministry of Magic, I'd investigate Voldemort. Does the British Ministry know about Voldemort? Yes, Mr. President. Rest assured, they're looking into things. Good. In the meantime, what do you recommend that we do? Radner thought about it. First, I'd start increasing security all around the country. We don't know if Al-Qaeda has this superweapon of theirs, but we have to assume that they have such a weapon and are capable of deploying it. Second, we need to send spies into Al-Qaeda and Riyadh to figure out what the hell is going on. If they have a shot at assassinating Dilmy and putting a Muggle in charge, they should do it. Al-Qaeda will probably be upset, but a Muggle is a much less dangerous opponent than a wizard. Clinton jotted down some notes. Makes sense. Do you think we should warn the Muggles? Radner shook his head. I wouldn't, sir. They'll likely just panic. After all, there isn't much they'd be able to do against a magical opponent. That's our speciality, not theirs. Clinton nodded. I agree. I'll tell the Secretary of Defense and the CIA to make the necessary arrangements. You talk to the people in Dana. Now, let's get to some specifics. If they do target us with this weapon, where do you suppose they will attack? Radner looked out the window. I'm not sure, Mr. President, and that's going to be a problem. The size of the weapon and estimate of casualties implies an attack on a city. I'd keep an eye on all the ports and increase security around the cabin. We don't want anything getting in there without our knowledge. Clinton sighed. That sounds like a good idea, Mr. Radner. I'll issue the necessary orders. However, may I make a suggestion? Radner raised his eyebrows. Yes, Mr. President. If you believe that the Ministry of Magic is a possible target, I'd recommend that we evacuate all high-level Department of Magic personnel, such as yourself, for instance, to a secure area until we've dealt with this problem. Would you be willing to stay here for the time being? At least for 1 week, until Dilmy's deadline expires. Radner thought, what you say makes sense, Mr. President. I don't know how they're going to attack the 4 towns with all the water in the way, but it's better to be safe than sorry. Clinton nodded. Make it so. Any other suggestions? The foreign policy advisor piped up. Should we freeze gas prices for a while? Any oil embargo is going to cause a panic. Remember what happened in the 70s. Clinton jotted down the note. Possibly. Let's see what happens first. In the meantime, we've got ourselves a plan. God help us all if the crap hits the fan. Dismissed. Chapter 144. The Dawn Ash Prophecy. May 11, 1996, 3 days to Siddiqui deadline Spanish House, Massachusetts, Institute of Technology, Cambridge. Massachusetts, United States of America, Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup Afia Siddiqui spent as much time in Spanish House as she dared. Her friend was happy to see her, of course. However, she noticed immediately that Siddiqui had something on her mind and insisted that she help. Siddiqui refused, of course. Everything had to be kept secret, especially an attempt at an assassination. If a friend found out about what she was doing, the friend would call the cops and she would be a goner. This would have forced Siddiqui to kill a friend, something she didn't want to have to do. She should have realized that killing a fellow student would be so difficult. Some people enjoyed killing, from what she'd heard. However, these people included people like Adolf Hitler, Vlad Dracul, and Joseph Stalin. Those people were psychopaths and deserved what they got. She, however, was not one of those. She was having second thoughts about going along with this plan. She had to do something, however. If she chickened out and Al-Qaeda found out, she was as much a goner as if the friend had called the cops. She'd probably be shot in the back by someone under the cover of an invisibility cloak. She had thought long and hard about how the deed should be done, and had decided that she'd go with a slow-acting poison which caused fatigue, unconsciousness, and finally death. Not only would that give her time to escape before the victim realized she'd been attacked, but it would provide the victim a painless death. She didn't want the witch to suffer more than she had to. Allah didn't want witches to live, but he didn't require that they die in agony. She had the vial of poison in her pocket. The plan was to get in the victim's bag of toiletries and spread some of it on the witch's toothbrush. Assuming that the woman brushed her teeth before going to bed, the effects would take place while she slept and take her out during the night. No one would suspect her, and it would make it even more certain that the witch would die without suffering. The next question, of course, was whether she would take the rest of the poison herself after committing the deed. She would have to do that, or have Dilmy or someone obliviate her. There were some memories she refused to live with. Determined to get this over with as quickly as she could, she took her leave from Spanish House and headed down the hall towards Russian House. She was caught several times in the main new house corridor by friends who tried to pull her aside and talk to her. She spoke with each for a few minutes and continued down the corridor. Finally, she found herself at the eastern end of the building, between the main entrance and new house 1. Fervently asking Allah to forgive her for what she was about to do and ensure her victim a place in paradise, she headed over to the entrance to Russian house and tried to open the door. Of course, it was locked. She looked past the door into the living room and saw there was no one there. It sounded like she would have to resort to the magical lockpick to get into the building. Curious as to what it would do, she positioned her body so that it blocked the view of the woman behind the dorm's reception desk and pulled the little knife out of her pocket. She placed it in the lock. There was a little flash of light, and a lock clicked. Blinking in surprise, she put away the knife and pushed on the door. It opened easily. Beyond the door was a large room which looked like it could have been in any dorm. The right half had a bunch of chairs facing a television set. The left half featured a dining area and an alcove leading to a kitchen. Opposite the alcove was a dorm room which looked to be larger than the others. That must belong to the GRT. There was a large mural of a Russian building on a wall, as well as clock with Cyrillic words for each number. Beyond this main room was a hallway which presumably led to the various students' dorm rooms. The first thing she had to do was figure out where this girl's dorm room was. She glimpsed a stairway leading up to a second floor. The stairs extended to the right of the main corridor, above some of the chairs facing the television set. It eventually switched back on itself as it continued on to the second floor. Trying to avoid asking people for directions unless there was absolutely no alternative, she headed down the corridor looking for the witch's room. The various whiteboards on the students' wall were littered with combinations of Cyrillic and English words, but they didn't help. Finally, she saw something which would help, a student directory. She picked it up and looked up the witch's name. As she suspected, it listed her phone number and her dorm room. Her heart in her throat, she headed over to that room and positioned herself to listen at the door to check if she was in. That was when 2 girls made their way across the staircase and walked in her direction. Both of them were wearing shirts with a sorority's letters on it. The letters matched those of the sorority the witch herself belonged to. Realizing that people would think she was eavesdropping, she jumped away from the door and continued walking down the hall. She found a bathroom and headed in there, hoping to find an empty stall. Fortunately for her, it was empty. This allowed her to leave the door open a crack to see what was going on. The 2 girls stopped in front of the witch's door and knocked. Siddiqui heard someone answer from inside there. The witch had been there the whole time. Counting her blessings, she continued her observation. The door opened, and the witch came out. She followed the girls in the general direction of the main room. Now was her chance, she thought. She still wanted to inspect the ladies' room, but she could always do that later. Now was the only time she'd get to go into the witch's dorm room. The dorm room looked like any other dorm room. She had just started looking around for the toiletries when she heard a shriek from the main room, followed by a thump. One of the girls spoke the witch's name in alarm and asked her what was wrong. Siddiqui froze. She had no idea what was going on. What she did know, however, is that she had to get out of the room immediately in case someone thought the witch was inside. She did so and found herself in the corridor again. Seconds later, someone spoke words which chilled her to the bone. The speaker sounded like the witch, but they seemed to be overlain with some power which reminded Siddiqui of Mohammed or the oracle at Delphi. Beware, House of Romanov. You will meet your doom 6 years after the rising sun arrives with ash. Siddiqui's mind raced. What the hell did that mean? She had the vague impression that the Romanovs were involved with the Russian Revolution and that they were dead. There was no House of Romanov anymore. No one spoke for a good 60 seconds. Finally, one of the girls who had visited the witch spoke her name and asked, "Ah, what was that?" The witch, oddly enough, seemed to not know what had happened. What was what? You mentioned something about the Romanovs. There was a pause, after which the witch said, "I did what?" You mentioned something about the house of Romanov being doomed. What's strange was that it sounded like you had become an oracle and were making a prediction. The witch's voice suddenly sharpened. I made a prophecy. Oh, what? The witch spoke over the girl. Prophecy, I'm a seer. I occasionally lose control of myself and speak prophecy. It's a talent which wizards sometimes have. What did I say? Beware, House of Romanov. You will meet your doom 6 years after the rising sun arrives with ash. There was a pause, after which the witch said, I have no idea what that means. However, I'm not good at interpreting prophecy. I'll tell the people in entry. Maybe they'll know what it means. However, I'd appreciate it if you keep this to yourselves. People will think I'm crazy otherwise. Being a witch is unusual in itself. Being a seer is doubly unusual, especially for muggles like yourselves. The two girls agreed, and the witch took a moment to take control of herself. All right, you two, what brings you over here? The three girls started talking for a minute, and eventually Siddiqui lost track of the conversation. However, that prophecy had shocked her to the core. She didn't realize that these people could see into the future. Dilmy had conveniently forgotten to tell her. What else had he forgotten to tell her? Something didn't seem right here. She suddenly had third and fourth thoughts about killing off this witch. Siddiqui was as curious as the two girls were as to what the prophecy meant and whether this girl would be able to tell her future. The incident had also reinforced her suspicion that the witch meant no harm to anyone. She knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to be able to kill the witch, not after this. This meant that she needed to seek asylum among the American wizarding community, especially after the 14th. She considered how she was going to do that. Perhaps this girl would be her savior instead of her victim.